The boy's voice cracked through the dusk like a whip of pain. They took my pa, mister. His small boots stumbled over the dry stones of the canyon floor, his face streaked with dust and tears. The wind carried his words into the red horizon, where the sun had already begun to sink behind the cliffs, bleeding gold into the shadows. The man he cried to stood still, tall, weathered, and silent, his dark hair bound with a strip of leather, his eyes sharp and still as the desert itself. He was an Apache, alone and unwelcoming, but something in the boy's cry pierced the armor of silence he had carried for years. The man had no name left to speak. The whites once called him Lone Hawk, though his own people had known him by another, a name long buried with his kin after soldiers burned his village to the ground. For months, he had walked the high country alone, hunting little, speaking to no one, the weight of ghosts on his shoulders. But now, a boy stood before him, shaking, clutching a torn hat in his hands. The boy's eyes were wide and wet, the color of the desert sky before rain. "Where?" Lone Hawk finally asked, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. Those riders, they came from the west. My pa wouldn't give them the mule, so they took him." The boy's lips trembled. "Please, mister. They said they'd hang him by sundown." The Apache said nothing for a long time. He looked out across the canyon, where smoke rose faintly against the dying light. The world had taken everything from him, and still it wasn't done taking. Yet here was this child, trembling before him, begging for the one thing that had already been stolen from him too many times, mercy. "Your name?" Lone Hawk asked. "Eli," the boy said, his voice small. "Eli Turner." Lone Hawk nodded once. "Stay here." Eli shook his head fiercely. "I can't. I ain't leavin' him." The Apache looked at him then, really looked, and saw something of himself in the boy's stubbornness, the same fire that refused to die even when the world tried to snuff it out. He didn't argue. He simply turned toward the west, and the boy followed, limping but determined, into the rising wind. They walked for miles across the desert, the boy stumbling, the man silent. Coyote cries echoed from the ridges. Night crept down, painting the rocks in silver. At last, from the edge of a ravine, they saw the glow of a campfire. 3 riders, whiskey laughter. A rope hung from the limb of a twisted mesquite, and beneath it, a man sat bound, his face bruised, his head bowed. Eli's breath caught in his throat. "Pa," he whispered. Lone Hawk raised a hand for silence. He studied the camp, his eyes moving like a wolf's. The riders were careless, 2 drunk, 1 half asleep. The Apache moved like smoke, circling downwind. Eli watched, heart pounding, hands shaking against his knees. There was a soft whistle of movement, a blur, and then silence. When Lone Hawk reappeared, 2 men lay still in the sand, and the third was staring down the muzzle of his own rifle in the Apache's hands. "Get up," Lone Hawk ordered. The man, big, bearded, with a mean look even in fear, rose slowly. "You took the boy's father." "Why?" The man spat. "Ain't none of your business, Injun. We was teachin' him a." The Apache struck him across the jaw before he could finish. The man fell, groaning. "You teach nothing," Lone Hawk said. "Only hate." Eli ran past him to his father, cutting at the ropes with shaking hands. The older man, battered but alive, pulled his son into his arms, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Eli, boy, what in God's name?" "Pa, I found him. He helped us." The Apache turned away, stepping back into the shadows. He wanted no thanks. He had done what he could, and that was all. But then he heard the boy's voice again, small, but strong. "Mister, wait." He stopped. The boy ran to him, breathless. "You can't just go. You saved him. You saved me." The Apache looked at him, and in the boy's wide eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long, long time, trust. A kind of faith that didn't ask for proof, that simply believed goodness was still out there, waiting to be found. "Take care of your pa," Lone Hawk said softly. The boy hesitated. "What about you? You got anyone?" Lone Hawk's silence was answer enough. Eli's eyes glistened again. Then come with us. We got a place, near the river. Pa can fix fences again. You can stay." The Apache's chest tightened. For a moment, he almost said yes. But he saw, in his mind, the faces of his wife and daughter, the smoke rising over the mountain. He couldn't bring his shadow into their home. "I walk alone," he said. Eli swallowed, tears trembling in the corners of his eyes. He wanted to say more, but his father's weak voice called him back. When he turned again, the Apache was gone, swallowed by the dark. For days afterward, the turners tended their wounds and spoke of the man who had appeared from nowhere to save them. The father called him a ghost. The boy called him a hero. But to Lone Hawk, wandering again through the desert, he was neither. He was simply a man who had remembered, for one brief moment, what it meant to care. Weeks passed. The rains came late that year, breaking the drought with a fury that carved rivers through the plains. One morning, while Eli gathered wood near the riverbank, he saw something half buried in the mud, a small, carved figure of an eagle, feathers etched with patient hands. He wiped it clean and held it tight, smiling through the tears that came without warning. He knew who had left it. Time rolled forward. Eli grew. The scars on his father's back faded, though never entirely disappeared. But the story of that night, the boy who cried for his pa and the Apache who listened, became something more than memory. It became a lesson. Years later, when Eli was a man himself, he often rode through that same canyon, helping travelers lost on the trail, never turning away a stranger. Some said he did it to repay a debt, but he knew better. He did it because, in one desperate moment, someone had shown him that mercy wasn't a weakness, it was the only thing that could keep the world from turning to dust. One summer evening, as the sun melted over the desert, a rider appeared on the horizon, tall, old, wrapped in a faded blanket. Eli, now graying at the temples, squinted against the light. The stranger rode slow, as if the years weighed heavy on him. When he dismounted, Eli's breath caught in his chest. Lone Hawk, the old man's eyes were dim but kind. You remember. Eli smiled, his throat tight. I never forgot. They sat by the river, the sound of water filling the silence between them. The Apache's hair was silver now, his hands scarred and trembling. You stayed, he said softly. Made a life. Because of you, Eli replied. You didn't just save my pa. You saved me from hating. Lone Hawk's eyes glistened, though his voice stayed even. Hate is heavy, hard to carry long. He looked out across the plain. I carried it too far. Eli put a hand on the old man's shoulder. Then let it rest now. You're home here. For the first time in decades, Lone Hawk stayed. He built a small hut near the water, helped mend fences, taught Eli's children how to read the tracks of deer, how to listen to the wind. He never spoke much of the past, but the children knew. They could see the sorrow in his eyes when the firelight flickered. One winter, when snow dusted the desert white, Lone Hawk fell ill. The years had caught up, and his body, once strong as stone, was failing. Eli sat beside him, holding his hand as the fire burned low. You gave me back my father, Eli said. Now I'll see you off as mine. The old Apache smiled faintly. The boy who cried for his pa, he murmured. And the Apache who listened. His eyes closed. The wind outside sighed through the canyons like a prayer. In the spring that followed, Eli carved a marker beside the river. It bore no name, only the symbol of an eagle with wings spread wide. The children asked what it meant, and Eli told them the story, the cry, the stranger, the night of mercy. Remember, he said, when someone cries for help, you listen. No matter who they are. And so the legend grew. Travelers spoke of it by campfire light, the story of how a single act of kindness bridged two worlds once torn by hate. Years turned into generations, and the desert kept its silence. But on certain nights, when the wind came down from the mountains and the stars shone clear, it was said you could still hear a voice on the breeze, half whisper, half prayer, saying, I listened. And somewhere, in the eternal vastness of the desert, the boy's cry still echoes, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. Because kindness, once given, never dies. It moves from heart to heart, like a flame that refuses to go out, lighting the darkness one soul at a time. And in that endless light, the Apache still walks, not alone anymore, but carried forever in the memory of a boy whose heart